Okay, so I wanted to do just 2 more practice problems with the inverse trig, as well as kind of reviewing everything we have so far, because we have 3 tools, we've had 3 lessons in our trigonometry toolbox. You definitely want to write this down. You guys don't have this in your packet. You want to either just kind of have it in your packet somewhere on a blank page, if there is one, or on a separate piece of paper to have your notes for your test, because on your test, you have to be able to look at a problem and go, okay, based on what I know. Notice I kind of said here what we know. In this case, it doesn't matter what we know, because based on what we're trying to find, we'll know what we need to do. But again, we have to look at a problem and go, okay, I have this information. This is what it's asking me to find. So this is the tool that I'm going to use. You are not going to be told, use Pythagorean Theorem, use regular trig, use inverse trig. You have to look at the problem, look at what you have, and say, okay, I need to use this tool. So when we know 2 sides of a right triangle, so they give us 2 sides, and we are trying to find the 3rd side, be very careful that it's important that we know 2 and we're trying to find a side. That's important. This is Pythagorean Theorem, right? This is a squared plus b squared equals c squared, if you want to add that in there too. Because if I know 2 of these variables, I can find the 3rd, right? Because we only have 1 missing variable. So that is, again, Pythagorean Theorem. Know 2 sides, trying to find a 3rd side. Now, what if we only know 1 side and an angle, and we are trying to find a side? Well, I can't do Pythagorean Theorem then, even though we're trying to find a side length, because I have to have 2 sides in order to use Pythagorean Theorem. So if I only have 1 side, that's going to be our regular trig. That'll be SOHCAHTOA, labeling your sides, doing the whole thing and going from there, cross multiplying, all that. Now, if we're trying to find an angle, so notice this is the only one where we're trying to find an angle. We have 2 tools in our toolbox for if we're trying to find a side, but when we're trying to find an angle, our only tool is inverse trig. So once more, you have to be able to look at a problem and go, okay, here's the information I have, here's what I'm trying to find, I'm going to use this. So just a reminder as well, the difference between regular trig setup and inverse trig setup. So remember that it is always for regular trig. Regular trig, you have your trig function next to your angle. So again, this could be sine, cosine, tangent of 30 degrees, 45 degrees, whatever. They are married together in regular trig. Equals your fraction. This is when we are trying to find a side length. That's going to be our setup. Now for inverse trig, the world is reversed. And basically, the trig function and the angle are now divorced. Everything is messed up and opposite. Yeah. So now it's our inverse trig. So remember, this is a different button on the calculator. Remember, you don't type the -1 yourself, which is a different button on our calculator. And the angle and the fraction switch places. So now our trig function and our angle are divorced. We're in opposite land here. So we have to plug this in to get our angle. So what we're going to do from here is we're going to practice 2 more of the inverse trig questions, since you guys watched the video for that before you go do your assignment. And then we are going to do a little bit of a review as well on the 3 tools that we have. So with inverse trig, we have to focus on what angle we're trying to find. This is the angle we are labeling our sides in respect to. So take a moment. Again, you do not have this in your packet. This is just extra stuff. All of this is extra stuff this whole lesson. We have 4 and 6. We can label all 3 sides if it helps us, because sometimes it's hard to know 2 without kind of knowing what the 3rd is. But we are going to use these 2 sides. So take a moment. We're going to eventually use SOHCAHTOA. Label the 4 and the 6, and if you want to, you can label this side too. What do we got? Opposite, adjacent, hypotenuse, what are they? Okay, so if you would like to, because I know some people do this first, across from our angle, this is the opposite, which we don't have. So don't get confused. I am not using this side, but sometimes that helps us figure out what the other side are. X, this is the opposite side. Across from the 90, so again, across from our angle, that's opposite. Across from the 90, this is our hypotenuse. And therefore, that leaves 4 to be the adjacent. So what I would do is I would erase the side I don't need so I don't get confused, so that I can focus on the fact that we have adjacent, we have hypotenuse. Which trig function are we using? Cosine. Guys, I really don't know how to make this more clear. A, H, A, H. Be confident. I think sometimes you guys just are so unsure and you're scared of making a mistake. Take a guess. Yeah, but I really don't know how to make that much more clear. Adjacent, hypotenuse, we're using cosine. That's what the C stands for. Now again, because we are finding an angle, we need to use inverse trig. Finding an angle, inverse trig. So inverse, remember, the world is messed up, it's opposite. Now our fraction goes next to the inverse trig function. So if cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse, what's going to be our fraction? 6 over 4 or 4 over 6? 4 over 6 because that's the adjacent over the hypotenuse. Once again, I don't know how much more clear to make that. A over H, yeah? It's ka, not cha. It's not H over A. This is going to equal our answer. The nice thing about inverse trig is you just write this, you plug it in the calculator and you're done. There's no fancy moving around you have to do. I'm going to go ahead. I should have already had Desmos pulled up, but I forgot to have it ready. Let's go ahead and plug this in the calculator. I'll show it one more time. So remember that to get to the inverse trig functions in Desmos, you click function. That's what the func is for. And there's your inverse trig. So you have cosine. We go back to main. And then our fraction was 4 over 6. Or I can click the fraction button. And there's our answer. I'm going to go ahead and round that to 48.2. And boom, you're done. Inverse trig is a lot easier because you don't have to move things around and get your variable by itself. It's already good to go. So try it one more time on the next one. Do the whole thing. We are trying to find angle A. You need to label your sides in respect to angle A. Use SOHCAHTOA to figure out which trig function you're using. Sorry, this is the right angle. And see if you can go from there. Do the whole thing. Okay, so across from the angle we want, this is the opposite. Across from the 90, that's our hypotenuse. And therefore, 5 is the adjacent. Now, once again, the only reason why I labeled this side is because it might help us figure out what this is. Across from our angle is opposite. Across from the 90, hypotenuse. Adjacent is the one left over. But don't get confused here, because I'm not using the hypotenuse because I do not know it. They gave me no number. So once more, I do not know how to make this more clear. If we have the opposite and the adjacent, you're picking the trig function that has O and A. That's tangent, TOA, right? The T stands for tangent. This is opposite over adjacent. So inverse trig set up. Fraction goes next. Again, this is switched. Now our trig function and our angle are divorced. And our fraction here is O over A, O over A. Your fraction should have been 4 over 5. Once again, you do not get to choose what goes on top or bottom. It has to be whatever the opposite is and whatever the adjacent is. 4 over 5, and there's my answer. I'm going to round that to 38.7. Okay. So your assignment for this is going to be super easy. It's just 3 of these problems. If you'd like to, you can pause the video right now and go do the assignment. I might recommend that because the next part we're going to do is just reviewing our tools, being able to look at 3 very similar looking situations and figure out what tool are we using. So again, if you want to pause the video, go do the assignment and then come back, you can. Okay, but let's go ahead and look at these problems. So these 3 triangles look very similar. In fact, I copied and pasted them. What I changed was what information we have and what we're trying to find. So what I want you to do, you are not solving yet. We can go through and solve these. I'm going to kind of just run through it really quickly at the end. But what I want you to practice is looking at a problem and knowing the tool to use. So again, we have 3 things here. We have a squared plus b squared equals c squared. This is Pythagorean Theorem. we have regular trig, and we have inverse trig. So look back to the notes you wrote down from that first slide. What I want you guys to do is look at these three problems. We have A, B, and C. Based on what we wrote down on that first slide, all I want you to do is say, what tool are we going to use for this question? Look at what information is given. For example, I'm trying to find a side length here. X is a side length. I have one side, I have one angle. Look to what you wrote down, figure out what you're going to use. I want you to do that for all A, B, and C. Oops, sorry. Okay, let's check. So I am again assessing. I am finding a side, and it might even help to write some notes. Finding a side, and I have an angle. I have one side given to me. I have 4, right? And an angle. This is, based on what we wrote down over here, this is regular trig. So for letter A, you should have written regular trig. You did not have to solve it. Okay, for B, we are trying to find a side, and I have 2 sides. This is Pythagorean Theorem. This is a squared plus b squared equals c squared. If you're trying to find a side, these are your only 2 options, right? Pythagorean Theorem is when we have 2 sides. Trig is when we have an angle. So for C, obviously that leaves inverse trig, but how we know for certain is because we have to use inverse trig if we're trying to find an angle. So I'm going to real quickly, actually I lied because the bell just rang and I have to go sub. If you would like me to check your answers for these, you can ask me. You can send me a reminder. You can say, hey, what are the answers? I might give them to you guys afterwards. And then we'll go from here once you have this all finished.